Hello, everybody. This is Ed Schilling at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I've been conducting studies of the sunflower family since the early 1980s, before we even knew how to spell DNA. This research has taken me many places in the world, including Australia, where I learned that this is called the daisy family. In this presentation, we will close the review of tribes of Asteraceae by looking at a large one, which is so distinctive that it took DNA-based studies to uncover its actual relationships.
Eupatorieae is a large and readily recognized tribe of Asteraceae. Despite its distinctiveness, it doesn't have a catchy common name like sunflowers or daisies or thistles. They are sometimes called thoroughworts, after the name of an eastern North American species. Eupatorieae is one of the more species-rich tribes of Asteraceae. There are over 2,300 species, with many still being described. These are currently distributed among about 180 genera, although a large number have only one or a small number of species. The genus-level classification of the tribe has changed greatly over the past 50 years and has been a source of contention. Geographically, the tribe is found primarily in the New World. There is only a single species native to Europe, and at most a few dozen each to Africa and Asia. None are originally native to Australia. However, botanists around the world are now familiar with at least a few species that have become widely distributed as cosmopolitan weeds, and in some places count among the worst invasives. In the New World, the major centers of species diversity is Mexico, which has over 500 species, eastern Brazil with over 600, and especially in the Cerrado regions, and the Andes Mountains of western South America, which remains incompletely analyzed. A few Eupatorieae are attractive enough to be found in flower gardens. These include the blazing stars, the Joe Pye weeds, and the floss flowers in the genus Ageratum. Tropical gardens may find the purple torch flower, Bartlettina. Close inspection of all of these will reveal that the most visible and colorful part of these are the style branches. One member of Eupatorieae that has joined world commerce is Stevia robodiana, the sweetleaf plant, and the source of the artificial sweetener, Stevia. It has a global market value nearing $500 million. Not too bad for a little Asteraceae. On the negative side of the ledger, Eupatorieae has supplied some of the noxious weeds, including those pictured here. They tend to reproduce rapidly and form large colonies, displacing native vegetation and interfering with crop production. Within Asteraceae, Eupatorieae are regularly recognized by a distinctive combination of traits. We will use a classic illustration of the type species of the tribe, Eupatorium cannabinum, which is the only European one, to point out some of the traits of the tribe. The first is the discoid heads. They contain only disc flowers. The corollas are often tubular, with short erect lobes. Within a head, all the typical flowers are typically alike, although there's a few species in which the outer ring of disc flowers is somewhat enlarged compared to the others. The florets are bisexual, and they are colors of white or purplish or red, but never yellow. There's never a specialization of having distinctive pistillate or staminate flowers. The style branches form a striking feature of Eupatorieae. They are much elongated above the stigmatic areas, and these portions are called the appendages. They are long, often colorful. In many cases, they provide the visual aspect of the heads. And the tips of these are blunt, which is in contrast to the somewhat similarly long style appendages found in Vernonae, but those have acute tips. The stigmatic surfaces at the base of the style branches are paired. It is common to have glands attached to the sterile surface that separate these stigmatic areas, and this has been suggested to be an apomorphy for the tribe, but it's not really been thoroughly surveyed to know its distribution. The stamens also provide distinctive traits. There is characteristically a sterile projection above the anthers called the Anther Appendage. In Eupatorieae, these are flat, unlike the concave anther appendages found in other members of the Helianthia alliance, and they also lack glandular trichomes, which are frequently in other Helianthia. Note that this feature can be reduced in size or even absent in some species. The Cypsela, also called achenes, provide other characteristic features. In many members of the tribe, there is typically a pappus of bristles. But there's a number of other pappus types, and the pappus of bristles might not even be an apomorphy for the tribe. The Cypsela itself is blackened at maturity because of the presence of phytomelanin compounds. These are also called carbonized. This is a significant and major morphological feature that unites Eupatorieae with the Helianthia alliance, within which it's clearly derived based on molecular phylogenetic results. A final field trait to mention that can be useful but it's not absolute is the leaf arrangement. In most Eupatorieae, this is opposite. This is in contrast to the superficially similar Vernonae, but these, in that tribe, they are usually alternate-leaved. Cassini is given credit for being the first one to recognize the tribe. In his famous diagram, shown on the right here, it's placed near the Vernonae, which it superficially resembles. They both have discoid heads and long styles. The true relationships of Eupatorieae were first revealed from molecular phylogenetic studies, which placed it as an in-group to the Helianthiae, which we now, as we have heard today, is now referred to as the Helianthiae alliance, a whole set of tribes. A number of botanists have contributed to the treatments of various genera in the Eupatorieae. One well-known is Benjamin Lincoln Robinson, or B.L. Robinson, and he contributed treatments of a number of genera during his career at the Gray Herbarium of Harvard University. The major force of our current understanding of Eupatorieae was provided by another Robinson, who was part of a somewhat unlikely pair, King and Robinson, working mostly out of the Smithsonian Institution. Robert King got interested in Asteraceae in Texas and paired with the bryologist Harold Robinson in a long-running series of the tribe. Robinson was a bryologist, and he brought the inclination to view plants through a microscope and even a compound microscope. Together, they rearranged the tribe from top to bottom, especially at the genus level, and vastly enlarged the tribal classification, the results being presented in a series of over 200 papers over a couple decades, and culminating in a summary publication through the Missouri Botanic Garden. In the process of the work, they took Eupatorium, which had been one of the premier large genera of the world, and reduced it to only middling size, splitting out quite a number of other genera, some monotypic and with just a few species, from what had been formerly this gigantic genus. Looking at generic level recognition, we can go through some features that are widely used. The first of these is involucre type, and there's a characteristic set of terms that's used for this particular tribe. The X-imbricate type consists of a single ring of phyllaries, all of which are about the same size. And these are pretty much, don't overlap much with each other. They're not quite like the picket fence we see in the Senecio, but they're just all pretty much the same length and a single or at most two rings of these. This is called X-imbricate and exemplified here in the genus Ageratina, one of the segregates from Eupatorium. The imbricate type is pretty easily recognized, and this consists of a series of bracts which overlap one another, and because of differences in length, they form a somewhat elongate involucre here. And this is shown in the blazing stars, the genus Liatris. Sometimes it can be difficult to determine the involucre type because it falls off early, as is the case in Praxilus. And so these imbricate bracts, which are pretty visible when they're early in flower, if you make a specimen and they're in fruit, these tend to fall off, leaving it difficult to determine the involucre type. Finally, there's an intermediate type that's recognized, and this is called Sub-Implica. And these have bracts that slightly overlap, and they're in 2 or 3 series, and the inner ones are longer than the outer ones. And this is shown in this beautiful Mexican plant, Eupatorieae triangulare. And here is enlargement of an actual flower, showing the conspicuous style branches which make up the coloration of this. If it sometimes seems difficult, particularly to distinguish between X-imbricate and Sub-imbricate, you are not alone, because King and Robinson admitted that there is some interpretation involved in learning these involucre types. Characteristics of the Subsella, including the pappus and the number of ribs, have been important features for recognizing genera and even tribes. Subtribes, excuse me. And so there's a range of variation from lacking a pappus to having a scaly or coroniform one. We can see a coroniform one here in Paneroa, scales in Ageratum, and then a pappus of bristles, which we see here in Conoclinium, and perhaps a little bit more clearly in the illustration here on Eupatorium. Like many other groups of Asteraceae, these have proven not to define clades unilaterally. And for instance, in this particular case, these 3 different plant genera, which have quite different pappus types, are actually part of a single clade of closely related genera. And they are quite separate from Eupatorium, which would have the same pappus type as Conoclinium. The number of ribs on the Subsella is another feature that's been classically used. Eupatorium, one of the major features to divide the megagenus Eupatorium, was having 5 ribs. And then there are a number of genera that have twice that number of ribs, so they have 10 ribs, including Liatris, the blazing stars, and also Brachylia. This is another one that does not well define clades. And for instance, both Eupatorium and Liatris are part of a clearly defined, based on molecular data, clearly defined clade in North America, and they are quite separate from Brachylia. Another feature that was used particularly by Bentham in addition to the Subsella ribbing is the presence of these anther appendages at the apex of the stamens. And so here is a nice illustration by Nick Hind from the Kew Bulletin showing the prominent anther appendage in Praxillus. In contrast, there are some genera, such as Beccaria, in which this feature is completely lacking. Again, this has been shown in practice to be homoplasious in terms of defining clades. A couple of other floral microcharacters are visible in this illustration by Mariana Grossi of Stomatanthes, and these are the pubescence, presence or lack of pubescence at the base of the styles, which can help to separate some genera, but again does not define clades. And then there tends to be a group of thickened cells at the base of the stamens called the anther collar, and the shape of the anther collar and the nature of these thickenings when viewed with a compound microscope can be helpful, although it's not a really great field character. Mariana Grossi, in fact, published a very recent paper on various things that have been called floral microcharacters, and she discusses how this term is a little problematic. But these diagrams from her paper show the beautiful illustrations of these, of various things that you can find that vary within the Eupatorieae. Again, in practice, these have not been shown to define clades, or in some cases, they just haven't been very thoroughly surveyed to know what their total distribution is. There are a couple genera of Eupatoriae that are readily recognized because of the distinctive aspects of their heads. One of these is Stevia, and this is one of the largest genera of the tribe. And in the heads of Stevia, there are exactly 5 bracts and 5 flowers. So here we can see this classical illustration of Stevia ovata with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 involucral bracts, and it will have 5 flowers associated with its head. This particular species has a pappus of bristles, but other species of Stevia may have a pappus of scales or a mixture of scales and bristles. This particular species has become a weed in Australia, and these illustrations come from the Brisbane City Council Weed Identification Tool and show nicely the kind of distinctive corollas we get in Stevia. In this case, rather than just projecting upward from the tube of the corolla, these are actually come off at right angles. And you can see, if you count again, that there are 5 flowers in each head that are visible in the illustration here, the image here of Stevia ovata. Another genus that is readily recognized by having a finite number of parts to the head is Mecanium. This is the largest genus of Eupatorieae, and so recognizing that these have exactly 4 bracts and 4 flowers will let you identify a large number of species to genus. So you can see here in this illustration from the flora North America of Mecania scandens, a common vine in the southeastern United States. Each head has 4 involucral bracts and then 1, 2, 3, 4 flowers. You can also see this in a photograph and count the number of flowers here, at least, of Mecania scandens. Many species of Mecania are vines, but this is not universally the case. There are also species that are shrubby and have an erect growth habit, including one that was recently described from Brazil. And this shows, again, the involucre with its 4 bracts, the exactly 4 flowers per head, but instead of vines, they are shrubby. They have an erect growth habit. Attempts to separate this into 2 genera, however, have failed because the 2 growth habits do not reciprocally define clades within the genus. There's a lot of individual variability in Eupatorieae that we don't have time to discuss. To give a flavor, here's an interesting plant collected by an interesting botanist. In the early 20th century, Inez Mexia traveled extensively in Mexico and South America, alone and on horseback. Not something that you would necessarily expect for a lady botanist to do. And on a trail to a waterfall that's now a beautiful tourist attraction in the state of Jalisco, she picked up this particular plant, which was named for her by B.L. Robinson, Mexianthus mexicanus. It has these really neat one-flowered heads. So here's the involucre with a single flower, and these are clustered into these spherical clusters, looking superficially like heads, but they are actually a head of single-flowered heads. Even though this looks so distinctive and is now recognized as a monotypic genus, molecular data that we obtained suggests it's actually a member of the larger genus Decacheta, and provides another example about how morphology can be misleading in Eupatorieae. Looking to the future, there are quite a few things that still need to be done in Eupatorieae studies. Large genera do not fit well into a standard PhD dissertation project, and they tend to be understudied. This is particularly the case for neotropical plants, where logistics of fieldwork can be formidable. The largest genus split out from Eupatorium ageratina is probably polyphyletic, and it really needs to be studied and compared between major centers in Mexico and the Andes Mountains. Mecania is just a huge genus, and it still has species remaining to be discovered. Guanophyllon and Chromalina, each with over 100 species, actually are not distinctly separated from one another, and our preliminary data from the Caribbean region suggests that they are not currently delimited properly, at least in that region. And then Fleishmania may be one of the largest genera that you've never heard of, with over 100 species, and there's never been a comprehensive treatment of this. One exception is Stevia, where a group in Japan has studied them comprehensively and produced a very nice recent paper on that in the Journal of Plant Research. There are particular areas that still need to be studied as well. My colleagues in Brazil are very active and covering really lots of neat things, but there are just lots of species to be discovered there. The Andes Mountains is not well explored for Eupatorieae, and Mexico remains a center of diversity and still needs lots of work. And then finally, going beyond just the basic classification, there is so little we know about biology of these things. Most of these have not had even a chromosome count. In many of the genera, we rely on a single species in the genus as a guess. That's the base chromosome number. If you have grown Eupatorieae, you know that they are pollinator magnets. They attract all kinds of insect visitors, yet we don't know much about the pollination biology or their importance in ecosystems. How they get around with their pappus types, etc. Still a lot to be learned, a great field to go into. Beyond the basic, as a tribe, Eupatorieae has both beautiful plants and nasty ones, but the vast majority of them have not garnered any particular attention because of their looks. And there still remains a lot of work before we have a comprehensive knowledge of the tribe. Thank you.